The bullies pulled her coat off in winter. They didn't expect a head kick. The bitter December wind cut through the courtyard of Riverside High School like a knife, but Kira Nakamura barely felt it as she hurried across the frozen concrete toward the main entrance. Her thick winter coat, a practical navy blue puffer that had seen better days, hung loose around her small frame. At barely 5 feet tall, with straight black hair that fell like a curtain around her face, she had perfected the art of becoming invisible in crowded hallways. Kira kept her eyes down, clutching her worn backpack straps as she navigated through clusters of students. She had been at Riverside for 3 months now, ever since her family moved from California, and every day felt like walking through a minefield. The move had been difficult enough without having to start over at a new school where everyone already had their established groups, and she was just the weird, quiet girl who sat alone at lunch. "Well, well, look what crawled out of the woodwork," a voice called out behind her. Kira's stomach dropped. She recognized that voice immediately. Bryce Patterson, the self-appointed king of the junior class. Tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of confident swagger that came from never being challenged, Bryce had made it his personal mission to make her life miserable since her first week at Riverside. She quickened her pace, but heavy footsteps caught up to her easily. Bryce fell into step beside her, flanked by his usual crew. There was Jake Morrison, a stocky redhead with a perpetual smirk who seemed to feed off Bryce's approval, and Ashley Winters, a sharp-featured blonde whose cruelty was often masked by fake sweetness. "Ignore them," Kira whispered to herself, the same mantra she had been repeating for months. She had learned long ago that engaging only made things worse. At her old school in San Francisco, she had been just another face in the crowd, but here at Riverside, her quiet nature and obvious outsider status had painted a target on her back. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Bryce said, grabbing her shoulder and spinning her around. "What's with the coat? You look like a walking sleeping bag." Jake snorted with laughter. "Maybe she's homeless. That would explain the smell." Kira's cheeks burned, but she kept her mouth shut. She had dealt with worse than this. Growing up, her father had taught her that sometimes the strongest response was no response at all. Violence should always be the last resort, he had told her countless times during their training sessions in their garage dojo. A true warrior knows when to fight and when to walk away. But Bryce wasn't finished. He stepped closer, his friends forming a semicircle around her. "You know what? I bet you're probably freezing in that ridiculous coat. Maybe we should help you warm up." Before Kira could react, Bryce grabbed the zipper of her coat and yanked it down. The cold air hit her immediately, and she stumbled backward, trying to pull the coat closed again. But Jake was already reaching for her sleeves, and Ashley was laughing, that high-pitched giggle that made Kira's skin crawl. "Stop it," Kira said quietly, but her voice was lost in their laughter. "What was that?" Bryce taunted, pulling at her coat again. "I can't hear you over the sound of your teeth chattering." Other students had started to notice the commotion. Some slowed down to watch, while others pretended not to see what was happening. Kira spotted Mrs. Henderson, her English teacher, across the courtyard, but the woman was deep in conversation with another teacher and seemed oblivious to the situation. This had become the pattern over the past few months. Bryce and his friends would find her in the cafeteria, the library, or walking between classes, and they would make some cruel comment about her appearance, her accent, or her obvious lack of friends. They would knock her books out of her hands, accidentally bump into her in the hallway, or make loud comments about her when she passed by. Kira had tried everything she could think of to make it stop. She had reported it to the guidance counselor, who had given her a sympathetic look and promised to look into it. But nothing had changed. She had tried changing her routes between classes, eating lunch in the library instead of the cafeteria, and even arriving at school later to avoid the morning crowd. But Bryce always seemed to find her. "Come on, guys, leave her alone," a voice said from behind them. Kira turned to see Marcus Chen approaching. his camera bag slung over his shoulder. Marcus was in her AP literature class, and he had been one of the few students who had tried to include her in group discussions. He was tall and lanky, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and Kira had noticed him watching her sometimes during lunch when she sat alone. "Oh, look who's playing hero," Ashley said with a sneer. "What's the matter, Marcus?" "You got a thing for the weird girl." Marcus's face reddened, but he stood his ground. "I said leave her alone." Bryce laughed and stepped toward Marcus. "Or what? You gonna take pictures of us to death?" "Actually," Marcus said, raising his camera, "that's not a bad idea. I'm sure the yearbook committee would love some candid shots of you harassing other students." For a moment, Bryce's confident facade flickered. Being caught on camera would definitely complicate things for him, especially if the photos made it to the administration. But then his smirk returned, and he grabbed the camera strap and yanked it out of Marcus's hands. "Oops," Bryce said, letting the expensive camera clatter to the ground. Butterfingers. Marcus lunged forward to retrieve his camera, but Jake stuck out his foot and sent him sprawling across the concrete. The camera skittered away, and Kira heard something crack as it hit the edge of a planter. "No!" Marcus scrambled to his feet and rushed to his camera. The lens was cracked, and when he tried to turn it on, nothing happened. "This was my grandfather's camera. It's irreplaceable." "Maybe you should be more careful with your stuff," Bryce said with a shrug. "Now, where were we?" He turned back to Kira, but she was already backing away, her hands clutched around her coat. She couldn't watch this anymore. Marcus had tried to help her, and now his camera was destroyed because of her. The guilt was overwhelming. "Actually, you know what?" Bryce said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "I think you need to learn some manners. In America, we don't ignore people when they're talking to us." He grabbed her coat by the shoulders and pulled hard. Kira lost her balance and stumbled backward, but Bryce's grip was firm. With a sharp yank, he pulled the coat completely off her shoulders, leaving her standing in the freezing courtyard in just her thin sweater. "There," he said, holding her coat above his head like a trophy. "Now you can appreciate the lovely Minnesota weather." The cold hit Kira like a physical blow. Her sweater was thin cotton, meant to be worn under the coat, and the December wind cut through it like it wasn't there. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering violently. "Give it back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What was that?" Bryce cupped his ear theatrically. "I can't hear you over the sound of your teeth chattering." Jake and Ashley were laughing hysterically now, and more students had stopped to watch. Kira could see the mixture of discomfort and morbid fascination on their faces. They knew what was happening was wrong, but nobody wanted to be the next target. "Please," Kira said louder this time, "give me my coat back." "Oh, she can speak," Bryce said, "but I don't think you're asking nicely enough. Maybe if you got on your knees and begged." Something inside Kira snapped, not the explosive kind of anger that led to rash decisions, but the cold, focused fury that her father had taught her to recognize and control. She had been holding back for months, telling herself that fighting would only make things worse, that her parents would be disappointed, that she needed to be better than her bullies. But as she stood there, shivering in the courtyard, watching Bryce wave her coat around like a flag, while other students laughed and filmed with their phones, she realized that her restraint had been mistaken for weakness. Her father had taught her that a warrior chooses their battles, but he had also taught her that some battles choose you. Kira stopped shivering. She straightened her spine and looked directly at Bryce for the first time in months. "Give me my coat." There was something different in her voice, something that made Bryce's smile falter slightly. But he had an audience now, and backing down would mean losing face. "I don't think so," he said. "Maybe I'll keep it. Consider it payment for all the entertainment you've provided." He turned to hand the coat to Jake, and that's when Kira moved. For 12 years, since she was 5 years old, Kira had trained in Taekwondo under her father's instruction. Master Hiroshi Nakamura had been a 3-time national champion before retiring to open his own dojo, and he had passed his skills on to his daughter with patience and discipline. Kira had earned her black belt 2 years ago, and she had been training for her second dan when they moved to Minnesota. Her father had made her promise never to use her skills unless absolutely necessary, and she had kept that promise even when it meant enduring months of humiliation. But watching Bryce destroy Marcus's camera and then steal her coat in front of half the school, she realized that this was absolutely necessary. Bryce was still turned away when Kira's right leg snapped up in a perfect crescent kick. Her foot connected with his wrist with a sharp crack, and her coat went flying. He spun around, clutching his wrist and staring at her in shock. What the hell? Kira's left leg came up this time, a precise side kick that caught him in the solar plexus. All the air rushed out of Bryce's lungs, and he doubled over, gasping for breath. The courtyard had gone completely silent except for the sound of his wheezing. Jake started forward, but Kira was already moving. She spun on her left foot and brought her right leg up in a high roundhouse kick that stopped just inches from Jake's face. He froze, eyes wide with terror, as he realized how close he had come to having his jaw broken. "Don't," Kira said simply. Jake stumbled backward, hands raised in surrender. Ashley was already backing away, her face pale with shock. Bryce straightened up slowly, still gasping for air. His face was red with humiliation and rage, and Kira could see him calculating his next move. He outweighed her by at least 60 pounds, and his pride was wounded. She knew he would try to rush her. "You think you're tough?" he wheezed. "You think one lucky kick makes you some kind of fighter?" "I think you should walk away," Kira said calmly. She had slipped into the fighting stance her father had drilled into her thousands of times, balanced on the balls of her feet with her hands relaxed at her sides. "Like hell!" Bryce snarled, and he charged. Kira sidestepped his clumsy rush and grabbed his outstretched arm. Using his own momentum against him, she pivoted and threw him over her hip in a perfect judo throw. Bryce hit the concrete hard, rolling to absorb the impact, but Kira was already moving. She dropped down and trapped his arm in an armbar, applying just enough pressure to make him feel the hyperextension in his elbow. One more inch of pressure, and she could dislocate his shoulder or break his arm. "Do you give up?" she asked quietly. Bryce struggled for a moment, but the position was hopeless. He was face down on the concrete with his arm trapped, and any movement he made only increased the pressure on his joint. "I give up," he gasped. "I give up." Kira held the position for another moment, then released him and stood up. Bryce rolled over, clutching his arm and staring up at her with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "You're crazy," he said. "You're absolutely crazy." "Maybe," Kira said, picking up her coat and putting it on, "but I'm warm." She walked over to where Marcus was sitting on the ground, still cradling his broken camera. "Are you okay?" Marcus nodded, though his face was pale. "I can't believe you just did that." "I'm sorry about your camera," Kira said. "I'll help you get it fixed." "Don't worry about it," Marcus said, climbing to his feet. It was worth it to see the look on his face. Around them, students were still staring in shock. Some were taking pictures with their phones, and Kira knew that by the end of the day, everyone in school would know what had happened. She felt a moment of panic. What if she got suspended? What if her parents found out? What if this made things worse? But then she looked at Bryce, still sitting on the ground with his friends hovering nervously around him, and she realized that she didn't care. For the first time in months, she felt like herself again. "Kira!" a voice called out. She turned to see Mrs. Henderson approaching, her face creased with concern. "What happened here?" "Nothing," Kira said quickly. "Just a misunderstanding." Mrs. Henderson looked between Kira and Bryce, clearly sensing that more had happened than anyone was willing to admit. But before she could ask more questions, the bell rang and students began hurrying toward the building. "Are you sure you're all right?" Mrs. Henderson asked Kira quietly. "I'm fine," Kira said. "Better than fine, actually." As the crowd dispersed, Bryce slowly got to his feet. His friends clustered around him, asking if he was okay, but he waved them off. He looked at Kira for a long moment, and she met his gaze steadily. "This isn't over," he said finally. "Yes, it is," Kira replied. "Unless you want a repeat performance." Bryce opened his mouth to say something else, then seemed to think better of it. He turned and walked away, his friends trailing behind him like confused puppies. Marcus fell into step beside Kira as they headed toward the building. "So," he said, "remind me never to get on your bad side." Despite everything, Kira smiled. "I'll keep that in mind." Over the next few days, Kira noticed subtle changes in how other students treated her. Some gave her a wide berth, clearly nervous about what she might do if provoked. Others nodded respectfully when she passed them in the hallways. A few even approached her to ask about martial arts, curious about her training. Bryce, meanwhile, seemed to have developed a sudden interest in avoiding her completely. He no longer sought her out between classes, and when their paths crossed in the hallway, he would look away and find somewhere else to be. Jake and Ashley had similarly made themselves scarce, though Kira occasionally caught them whispering and pointing when they thought she wasn't looking. The most significant change, however, was in Marcus. What had started as a simple act of kindness in defending her had evolved into something more. They began eating lunch together in the library, talking about books and photography, and their shared experience of being outsiders. Marcus was gentle and funny, with a dry sense of humor that caught Kira off guard and made her laugh despite herself. "You know," he said one afternoon as they sat in the library, "I always wondered why you never fought back before. I mean, it was obvious you could handle yourself." Kira looked up from her AP literature homework. "My father taught me that fighting should always be the last resort. He said that true strength comes from knowing when not to use your power." "And what changed your mind?" Kira was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I realized that sometimes not fighting is just another form of cowardice. I was so afraid of becoming like them that I forgot about standing up for myself." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Well, for what it's worth, I think you found the right balance. You stopped them without becoming them." It was true. In the weeks that followed, Kira found that she had no desire to seek out Bryce or his friends for revenge. The confrontation in the courtyard had been enough. She had proven her point and reclaimed her dignity, and that was all she had wanted. About a month after the incident, Kira was walking to her car after school when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Bryce approaching, alone this time. She tensed instinctively, but something in his posture told her this wasn't a confrontation. "I just wanted to say," he began, then stopped and looked down at his feet. "I wanted to apologize." Kira raised an eyebrow. "Apologize? For what I did? To you and to Marcus? It was wrong." He looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than arrogance in his eyes. "I've been thinking about it a lot, and I realized that I was just being a bully. Plain and simple." "What brought this on?" Kira asked. Bryce shrugged. "My little sister started high school this year. She's quiet like you were, and I kept thinking about how I would feel if someone treated her the way I treated you." He paused. "I guess I never really thought about how it felt from the other side." Kira studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. But he seemed genuinely remorseful, and she found herself believing him. "Apology accepted," she said finally. "But if you ever do anything like that again—" "I won't," Bryce said quickly. "I promise." As he walked away, Kira felt a sense of closure that she hadn't expected. She had stood up for herself, earned respect from her peers, and even managed to change the mind of her tormentor. It was more than she had hoped for when she first arrived at Riverside. Later that evening, she was practicing forms in her garage when her father came out to watch. He observed her movements silently for several minutes before speaking. "You seem different," he said finally. "More confident." Kira completed her form and turned to face him. "I had to use what you taught me at school." Master Nakamura's expression became serious. "Tell me what happened." Kira recounted the story of the confrontation in the courtyard, expecting her father to be disappointed in her for resorting to violence. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "You showed restraint," he said. "You could have seriously injured him, but you chose not to. That shows wisdom." "I was afraid you'd be angry," Kira admitted. "A warrior who never fights is not a warrior," her father said. "But a warrior who fights unnecessarily is not a warrior either. You found the balance between the two, and that is the mark of a true martial artist." As spring arrived and the school year wound down, Kira found herself settling into a comfortable rhythm at Riverside. She had made friends beyond Marcus, joined the photography club, and even started tutoring other students in mathematics. The quiet, invisible girl who had arrived in December was gone, replaced by someone who was still quiet, but no longer invisible. The incident in the courtyard had become something of a legend at Riverside, growing in the telling, until some versions had Kira single-handedly taking on half the football team. But the truth was simpler and more meaningful. She had stood up for herself and for someone she cared about, and in doing so, she had discovered her own strength. On the last day of school, as she was cleaning out her locker, Marcus approached with a small wrapped package. "What's this?" she asked. "A thank you gift," he said, "for helping me fix my camera and for being you." Kira unwrapped the package to find a small framed photograph. It was a picture of her that Marcus had taken during one of their library study sessions, captured in a moment when she was laughing at something he had said. But what struck her most was the expression on her face, confident, happy, and completely at ease with herself. "I love it," she said, and meant it. "I thought you might want to remember this year," Marcus said. "How much you've changed." Kira looked at the photograph again, then at Marcus, then out at the courtyard where her transformation had begun. "I think I'll remember it just fine." As she walked out of Riverside High School for the last time that year, Kira reflected on the lessons she had learned. She had discovered that standing up for yourself didn't mean becoming a bully, that strength came not from avoiding conflict but from choosing your battles wisely, and that sometimes the quiet ones were the ones you had to watch out for. Most importantly, she had learned that respect was something you earned, not something you were given, and that the best way to earn it was to first respect yourself. The girl who had once made herself invisible had found her voice, and she would never be silent again.